get back to poetry. Have you ever noticed how poetry is really the only art form that is virtually untainted by money and celebrity? I mean, no poet in his right mind or her right mind writes a poem thinking that they're going to get paid for it. Right? And there are no rock star poets. I mean, sometimes when I say that, people will say, well, what about Bob Dylan? What about Leonard Cohen? And there are examples of that kind of a writer. But I think of those men, the people like that, and Patti Smith, as minstrels. And that's not a derogatory term. They're wonderful artists, but their art form is words and music. It's not words. And that combination is a very different thing. It's a very different medium than poetry. Now, poetry is really the only remaining art form which is really untainted. There are no production costs, and no salary, no payments, no nothing. And I started out as a writer, as a poet. For many years, I wrote nothing but poetry. And so that was what I brought to me when I started to write about art. It was that experience of writing poetry and writing in that place of mystery, really, and discovering the mystery of art. First time I wrote about art, and I've written about art for many years, and I'm known chiefly as an art writer. First time I wrote about art was when, in the early 1970s, I was very new to contemporary art. I hadn't seen much contemporary art. I went to a gallery in San Fernando Valley and saw this exhibition, and the artist is the name of Gary Lloyd, and there were axes stuck into the wall, and words scrawled all over the wall, and Vaseline smeared objects around the place, and jars with things growing out of them. And my response was the great Philistine response: this is not. So I went home, and my poet's brain started working with this stuff and could not let it go. And what resulted was a 30-page poem, which got into the hands of the artist, and it got made into a book, and that was wonderful. But it was that experience of being open to what it was that I disliked that led me into this whole process of writing about art, which I've been doing ever since. So I've been thinking a lot about the nexus of art and money, art and celebrity, writing and money, writing and celebrity. Because, I'm not a famous writer, and certainly I have never, at any point in my writing career, having published novels and all the rest of it, I have never at any point been able to even consider making a living doing it. So and that's a curious place to be an artist, a creator, a writer, a poet, a painter, and to know that's what one is doing with one's life, and yet not be able to make a living doing it. Many years ago, I wrote an essay called A Word for the Amateur. At the time, I had just arrived at Otis Art Institute as dean. The day I arrived at Otis as dean was the day that the county supervisors, Los Angeles County supervisors, who had funded the school for its entire existence, voted to cut off all funds from the school as of the end of that school year. This was the time of the taxpayer revolt, the beginnings of the taxpayer revolt. Proposition 13 was, in process. It was a difficult time. I had faculty and staff who had no idea whether they were going to have jobs the following day. I had students who had no idea whether they'd be able to finish the degrees they started. It was a tough time, and yet, my faculty were out there in the studios and in the classrooms while they were doing general studies, teaching students how they had to be professional. That was kind of a buzzword at the time, in the 1970s. Artists had to be professional. That was the goal. And I thought to myself, how disingenuous, how basically dishonest to be turning out these students with their BFA degrees and MFA degrees into a world where we knew that 95% of them didn't have a chance in hell of being professionals. You know, they weren't going to find the galleries and have the exhibitions and get the reviews and sell to collectors and move on to museums. That's the traditional, that's the conventional way for an artist to be successful. I never thanked you, by the way, for coming out in this wonderful California weather. Isn't it great? I mean, it gets a little too much for tornadoes, but they're not Midwestern tornadoes. I did live in the Midwest for 4 years, and Midwestern tornadoes are a little different from California tornadoes. Thank you for being here. Let me get back to where I was. Professionals. So I wrote this essay called A Word for the Amateur. It was published in Art Scene magazine. And my thesis was that amateurs are honorable people. The great scientists, the great thinkers throughout the centuries have been amateurs. Charles Darwin, we were talking about Charles Darwin a little earlier, an amateur. He didn't do it for the money. He did it because that was his passion. And he was so engaged in it, he couldn't do anything else. That's who he was. So, and the word has become so debased now. It's, you know, an amateur artist is a Sunday painter, a dauber, one who lacks the skills and the sophistication to be a real artist. Well, that's nonsense. Amateur is a wonderful status, so far as I'm concerned. So I wrote this essay. It wasn't exactly popular in many circles in the art community, but there were those who really got what I was saying and really understood that we need to, in the circumstance, in the predicament in which we, artists, creative people, writers, and so on, in the predicament in which we find ourselves today, we really need to come to a different definition of success. What is success all about? How can I continue to live as an artist in a cultural environment which is not going to welcome my work and give it the kind of reward that I would love to get? I was going to read you a poem by Don Marquis, but I don't have time. Here's a poem by Don Marquis. It's terrific. Do you know Don Marquis? Has anyone heard of Don Marquis? You see, you don't hear it. How many people can name more than two poets? You know, a few. See what I'm talking about? Celebrity and poetry don't mix. Don Marquis, a wonderful poet of the early part of the last century, whose poems purport to have been written by Archie the cockroach, who jumps from key to key and can't make capital letters and can't make punctuation, so the poems are all without punctuation, without capital letters. And he has this cast of characters. Mehitabel the cat is one of his frequent collaborators. And here's his poem about Pete the parrot.